Hi everyone, welcome back. In this lecture, we are going to understand how exception handling works inside the Spring Security framework. Before we customize the error responses that we see in Postman, we first need to clearly understand how Spring Security handles exceptions internally. Now, Spring Security doesn't handle every kind of exception in your application. It mainly focuses on security-related exceptions, not business logic or general runtime exceptions from your service or repository layers. Inside the Spring Security Framework, there are two major types of exceptions it cares about. The first one is authentication exception, which results in an HTTP 401 unauthorized response. A 401 status indicates that the client is not authenticated. For example, exceptions like bad credentials exception or username not found exception are both subclasses of authentication exception. The second one is access denied exception, which leads to an HTTP 403 forbidden response. A 403 means that the user is authenticated but doesn't have sufficient privileges or roles to access a secured resource. So in summary, Spring Security primarily deals with two kinds of exceptions: authentication failures that cause 401 errors and authorization failures that cause 403 errors. Now let's see how Spring Security actually processes these exceptions behind the scenes. Inside the Spring Security filter chain, there is a special filter called ExceptionTranslationFilter. This filter monitors for security-related exceptions and decides what to do based on the type of exception thrown. If it's an authentication exception, it invokes a component called authentication entry point. The authentication entry point is an interface provided by Spring Security that defines how to handle authentication-related exceptions. By default, Spring Security provides multiple implementations of authentication entry point, and depending on your security configuration, the exception translation filter will choose the correct one to invoke. On the other hand, if the exception is of type access denied exception, then the exception translation filter calls a different interface, the access denied handler. The access denied handler interface handles authorization related exceptions, that is, cases where a user is authenticated but not authorized to access a specific resource. So now you can see the exception translation filter acts like a decision maker between these two exception types. Now let us go inside a Spring Security source code and let us understand how this exception translation filter works and how it decides which exception to handle. Alright, so let us go inside our project. So go to menu over here and then go to navigate and then click on search everywhere, and here just search for exception translation filter. Just open it and then just look for do filter method over here. Within a do filter method, you can see try catch block. Well, if there is any exception in our application, then that will be handled within the try catch block over here. So if there is any exception, that will be handled in a catch block. So let us look into this catch block over here. So within this catch block, you can see the method called handle Spring Security exception. So let us dive into this method, and within this method you can see if else if statement. So this logic basically decides which exception to handle. For example, if the exception is of type authentication exception, and then that will be handled by this method. If the exception is type of access denied exception, that will be handled by this method. Okay, so let us first see how this authentication exception handled. So let us dive into this method, and within this method there is another method called send start authentication. So just go inside this method, and here we have authentication entry point dot comments. So this authentication entry point is an interface. It has a multiple implementations. So let us dive into this comments method, and here this interface has a multiple implementations. You can see basic authentication entry point and other implementations as well. So we are basically looking into the basic authentication. So just go inside basic authentication entry point, and here you can see the comments method, and it has the logic like header and error. So in a header you can see this key and this value, and also the error you can see unauthorized, that is 401 and the value unauthorized. Well, if you go to the Postman client and if you pass the invalid user and password and click on send button, and here you can see the response. You are getting a 401 unauthorized status, like 401 is the status code and this unauthorized is the error. Next, if you go inside the headers, here you can see the key www-authenticate and then value basic realm rel. So this is coming from here. You can see response.header and then this is the key and this is the value. And this error, the status code and the error you are getting over here. So this is you are getting from here. It means whenever there is a authentication exception, then Spring Security invoke this basic authentication entry point, and then this comments method basically write the header and response to the HTTP response like this. Alright, so most of the time we need to customize the error response. So if you can see, there is no JSON in the response body. So ideally we should have a JSON error response that contains the information like timestamp, status, message, and reason, error, etc. So we'll see how we can customize the exception in upcoming lectures. So here just try to understand how Spring Security works internally and how it returns the error response. So in this case you can see we are passing invalid username password and Spring Security handled authentication exception and returned the 401 unauthorized status. And in header you can see this is the key and this is the value. So this is basically coming from this basic authentication entry point. Okay, so if I debug this, so let me add the debug points over here and let me start the Spring Boot application in a debug mode so that we can confirm this. Well, our application is up and running. Next, let us go to the Postman client and let's call this REST API again. Okay, let's go back to our project and here you can see we have added breakpoint and the control comes over here. Next, step into and then you can see name and value. So in header, go to the Postman. In a header also you can see key and value. Alright, now we understood that whenever there is a authentication related exceptions, then this basic authentication entry point will handle that and it write the response like this. Okay, next go back to the exception translation filter and then go to the do method, go to this method, and here now we have seen like how this method handles authentication exception. Next, let us look at the access denied exception logic. So if there is a access denied exception, then this method will handle that. So let us dive into this method. So within this method we can see this if else statement. Here basically this method checks whether the user is anonymous or not. If the user is anonymous, then this block will execute. Otherwise this else block will execute. So here within else you can see access denied handler and then dot handle. So let us go inside this handle method. So the access denial handler is an interface. It has a multiple implementations. You can see over here access denial handler IMPL and other implementations as well. So we just look into this access denied handler IMPL class. So just go inside this class. So within this class there is a handle method. So this handle method handle access denied exceptions and write the error message to the HTTP response. You can see the status code is written to the HTTP response, the attributes. Alright, let's summarize what we learned. Inside the Spring Security Framework, exception handling is managed by a filter called ExceptionTranslationFilter. It catches all authentication, exception and access denied exception errors and then forwards them to the respective handlers. Authentication entry point for authentication issues and access denied handler for authorization issues. Understanding this flow helps you easily customize how Spring Security sends error responses. In the next lecture, we'll define our own custom authentication entry point to send a more meaningful error response back to the client. Alright, great. I'll see you in the next lecture.